I'm the director of training at RAN3D, and we go through and offer training services on Creo, as well as some other CAD systems as well. And so I wanted to go through today and just talk about Creo Sheetmetal, and specifically concentrating on the walls, because that's the main tool that you're going to go through and use to go through and build your Sheetmetal part. So I want to quickly review the different wall choices and then give you a demonstration how some of these things work on here. Now, the first thing I want to just talk about is the different types of walls that you have. Now, for your primary walls, the first wall that you start with, you're going to have lots of choices. You can extrude, planar, revolve, sweep, helical sweep, boundary blend on here. Pretty much any way that you can build a regular solid, you could also potentially go through and build a Sheetmetal wall as well. Now, some of these would be extremely rare, like a rotational blend, a boundary blend to go through in Sheetmetal wall would be fairly rare. It's really going to be like the extrude, the planar. Those are going to be the two main ones on here. And then also keep in mind, once you've got your primary wall created, these types can also be used to build secondary walls as well. But there's also going to be a few specific secondary choices we'll look at as we go along. Now, extrude, probably one of the most common types of walls that you would create. You really just go through and make the side profile, and it's really just going to extrude that and turn it into the Sheetmetal. Now, remember, in Sheetmetal mode, you only sketch one side of the Sheetmetal. The computer's always going to add the thickness automatically to create the wall. You also can go through and do a planar wall. You really just sketch the outline of the wall. It's just going to go through and fill the inside of that sketch in and add the thickness to create the shape. That's also really common. You can also go through and do revolve walls again. Just, take that section and rotate it around to go through and create it, to build it. That would also be available to you. You could also go through and do a blended wall. So again, here they got multiple sections. They're going to start at kind of a large rectangle, and they're going to go through and blend to a smaller one to go through and create the wall. It would work almost identical to regular just solid blend, but it's just going to build a Sheetmetal wall instead. And then you also could potentially go through and do a boundary blend. Now, a boundary blend is where you would have to go through and lay out curves that give you the shape of what you want to create. And they've got curves in two directions here. There's kind of the two green curves that defines the left to right contour. And they've got the two blue curves here. That's the front to back. It's going to blend in both directions to go through and create the Sheetmetal wall. And then you also can go through and do offset. Now, offset as a primary wall will let you select a surface, but you have to have a surface to use this choice. So here they've got a surface that they've created, and they're just picking on that, and it's now going to go through and add thickness around there. Now, also, when you do an offset wall, you can specify a distance away. You'll notice the Sheetmetal wall they're creating is not right on the surface. There is a little bit of a gap there as well. And then you're also going to be able to sweep, where again, you've got a cross section, the blue sketch, that's just going to be swept down the trajectory, the green sketch, to go through and create the wall. And then you also could potentially go through and do a swept blend. Now remember, with the swept blend, it's a combination of a sweep and a blend. They've got that same green trajectory, but now they got two cross sections. There's kind of an L-shaped section at the beginning. There's a larger L-shaped section at the end. It's going to build the wall as it follows that trajectory, but also blend those two shapes to build it. And then again, you'd get a bunch of other miscellaneous ones that I don't really think anybody would potentially use. So I'll skip by those. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. When you are building your walls, under your options dropdown, there is going to be a choice here, add bends on sharp edges. Like to build this shape on the top, they've just gone through and drawn 3 lines, but there's some radiuses in the corner here. What they're doing is they're letting the computer add that radius through this add bend on sharp edges. And then all you would need to do is specify the size. So it makes creating the sketch easier. Now, if you wanted to, like you see down below, you could actually physically sketch the radiuses on there, but that's just more work. So I always try and use this option as much as I can, let the computer add the radius for me rather than try and sketch it out. Now, the only time you can't use it is if you're going to have like 2 different radiuses. I want one radius in the corner, let's say to be 1, and I want the radius in the inner corner to be 0.5. This is always going to apply the same thickness. So I would have to sketch at least one of those radiuses out then, and I could have the computer add the other one if I wanted. And then also, when you are building your wall, there is a thicken command inside the sketcher. Now, they kind of hide it, so it's not easy to find, But again, if you come over here under your feature tools and say thicken, what it will do is it will add thickness onto your sketch. You only sketch the one side, but when you go to dimension this, maybe I want to dimension to the other side of the sheet metal for some reason. You could come over here and then thicken the sketch, and you can see it creates a faint outline on the opposite side to the sheet metal, and you can now go through and dimension to either side to get the correct dimension scheme that you want. Now, if you are going to use this thicken option, though, you must have the radiuses sketched on the sketch. If you have a non-tangent corner, it will not let you use the thicken command on there. So that would be the other time that you'd want to go through and sketch the radiuses on, is to be able to use this. And then for your secondary wall types, and that's really what we're going to concentrate on here mainly today, is you're going to get flat, flange, twist, and you're also going to go through and get extend. Now, extend is really not under the wall category. It lets you kind of adjust an existing wall, but I'm going to add it here because it acts as kind of a secondary wall when you're done. And again, don't forget, for secondary walls, all your primary walls can be reused as well. Now, the flat wall. This is one of the most common secondary walls you run across. And when you hit the flat wall, it's going to ask you to select an edge that you want to attach to. Now, it does have to be straight to build a flat wall. Now, in Creo 7 and beyond, you can pick more than one edge. So you can see in this example, they went through and picked the two edges here that are highlighted in green, and they're actually adding two walls at once. But if you're in Creo 6 and earlier, you can only go through and do one edge at a time. You have to make multiple features for this. So it's a little bit more flexible now. So go through and pick your edges, and it's going to start to go through and create the wall. Now, you'll notice there's some choices, of course, across the top that we want to go through and look at. One is there's some settings here at the top. What side does it add the thickness on? So when it adds the sheet metal thickness, it can add it to the inside or to the outside of the existing geometry. You can go through and flip that around with this thickness side arrow to change it on here. And then also there's an area over here for bend dimensions. Does it go through and put a radius in the corner automatically? Now, again, like I mentioned, you probably want it to automatically, but you could actually turn that off. So over here on the right, they actually turned off adding the radius. It's just going to add the wall and leave the corners sharp on here. Now, if you do that, you will not be able to unbend this. You do need to have some type of radius in that corner to be able to unbend it, but you could come back and add it later if you wanted. But typically, you let the computer do it. And then again, if you are going to let the computer add the radius, then it's just a matter of specifying what you want that radius to be. Now, notice it defaults the thickness. It's going to use the thickness of the sheet metal as the bend radius. If you want something else, you can just type in whatever value you want over the top of that. And then also there is a drop down right next to that. That's where it lets you choose. Do you specify the inside or the outside bend radius for the size? It's going to default always to inside. Now, there's also going to be some different shapes. You can go through and have a rectangle wall where it goes along the edge. It could be a trapezoid. It could be an L shape. It could be a T shape. Those are built into the system. Now, if you wanted something other than that, you could now come over and say user defined. And if you said user defined, you could now come over here under the shape tab and create your own sketch. You could go into the sketcher and then draw whatever shape or profile you wanted that wall to be on there. And then also the length of the wall. When you do pick the edge, by default, the wall will always go the entire length of the edge. It's just the way it defaults. If you don't want it to go that far, there are some drag handles here at the end, those kind of yellow dots. You can drag those yellow dots and you can go through and adjust the length. So they went through and moved it in from this left end. It looks like 1.03 units on there. And then also bend position. There is a tab to define the bend position, and they try and illustrate the different choices here. Now they're taking this one wall and bending it down, and the default is to go through and make the wall even with the existing sheet metal. So where that original edge was, it's going to go through and make the new wall even with that. You also could come over though and use the second choice. You could go through and do an offset. Actually, the second choice is to go through and add all the material, the bend, outside of what was already there. So notice all the bending is occurring beyond the edge that they're attaching to on there. And then the next two choices both allow you to go through an offset. You know, here they went through and picked that same green edge, but they're offsetting the wall out. I want to create this wall out, a value of 0.34. Now the offset can go in either direction. It can go out like you see in the top picture on the left, or it could go back like you see on the bottom picture on the left. And of course, they just try and show you what it looks like from the side on the right. Now, the only difference between those two choices is just where does it measure to? Does it measure to the start of the bend, or does it measure to the wall on there? So it's always from kind of that reference edge, those measurements. And then the last choice, what if my bend is not 90 degrees? I've got some type of angle on here. Then what it will do is it'll take the end of that wall and make it even with the edge that you went through and selected on here. So that choice really is just used if it's some other angle than 90 degrees. But those are your different bend position choices. And then also you are going to be able to specify what they call corner treatment. Now with corner treatment, how does the computer handle where these two walls come together? Now, this is something that you really couldn't do in Creo 6 and earlier, because you would have had to have built these two walls separately. Now in Creo 7 and beyond, because you can pick those two edges together, you can create them at the same time. I can now come back and specify how I want the computer to handle that corner. So under corner treatment, notice one thing you can do is you can narrow the corner. And when you narrow the corner, it kind of closes off that gap that you get on the left-hand side. And then also up above, there is a type area here. It's currently set to an open corner, but you could have an open corner. You could come over here and say, I want to overlap them with each other. I want to do blind, where I kind of offset the two corners back from each other here. And again, when you overlap them, you can flip the direction. And then you can also come over here and do an overlap and specify a gap if you wanted to as well. So those would all be options for where those kind of two pieces of sheet metal come together in the corner. So that's corner treatment. Now you can also go through and add miter cuts. And again, this is new in Creo 7 and beyond. And so they had the original kind of green shape L. That was their original wall. And now they're coming back and adding a new wall, and they're picking those two edges that are highlighted in green. So what happens though is this wall is so wide that it starts to overlap itself. So what you can now do is you can come over here and turn on add miter cuts. Now, if you were to turn that off, it would actually build a wall that overlaps each other on here. But when you turn the miter cut choice on, it's now going to go through and kind of add a gap between. Now, again, you're going to get some choices here. You can go through and say, I want the corner to be created tangent, where it comes up to the tangent. You could also say it's going to be an open, a closed corner, a no gap corner, a rip corner. So there's going to be a number of choices now to control that. So that would have been extremely difficult to do in Creo 6 and earlier. You would have had to build two separate walls and then kind of cut each wall back individually to get that same shape. And then bend relief. Anytime that the wall does not go the entire length of the edge, I got to have some type of relief at the end. So again, they got this wall that's going about 3/4 of the way down. And so they're going through and just doing rip relief. Now the rip relief is just a zero volume tear. So at the end of that bend, it's just going to tear the sheet metal to let that part bend down and the other part remain straight. You could also do a stretch relief. Stretch relief is going to make like a little deformation area here in this corner. It's kind of tough to see in the picture, but it's actually kind of a triangle deformed area that's bending down. You could also add rectangle relief and oblong relief at the ends of the bends as well, if you wanted. Those choices are pretty much the same choices you've always had in the system. And again, you can do both sides the same. There is define each side separately. If you wanted one relief at one end and a different relief at the other, you would need to turn that option on. Otherwise, it would apply the same relief at each end. And then there's also corner relief. So bend relief is what happens at the end of the bend. Corner relief is where the two bends come together in the corner. So again, there's going to be some different choices. They currently have circular relief turned on. And so it's going to add this circular cutout notch in the corner on here. But you're also going to go through and be able to do some other choices here. It's going to default the V notch. You could also come over and do no relief. Those are pretty much the same thing. You could also come over here and say, I want to go through and have normal relief, where it just kind of cuts out where the two bends overlap. I could also do circular here. Now, these pictures that you see in the diagram, this shows you what the flat pattern would look like when you unbent it. So that gives you kind of an idea what the flat pattern would be. And you also could come over here and do square, rectangle, and then there's also going to go through and be round on here. So you can go through and apply that directly onto the corner when you create the walls. Now, if you were in Creo 6 and earlier, because you would have to have built those two walls separately, you would have had to have come back and added that kind of as a separate feature later on top, which you still can do if you wanted to in the newer versions of Creo. But it's kind of nice that it can be part of the initial wall. And then also, when you are doing the corner relief, here they're doing a square relief. Where does this square center itself on? Does it center itself at the intersection of the bends? So notice how it's going through and it's going to the middle of the two bend lines. That's what it's centered on. Or I could come over here and say I want it to be at the corner point. It's where the two bends kind of hit for the first time that it centers the rectangle on. So there will be some options here. Now there's also this orientation. You actually can go through and kind of rotate these shapes around if you wanted to. And you could use the orientation choice to accomplish that. I didn't get into that level of detail for this presentation. And then the flat walls again. Remember, you can pick as many edges as you want right now to go through and do the flat wall. Whereas before, Creo 6 and earlier, you would have had to have made 3 different walls right there. And also the nice thing about it is it does automatic corner detection. It recognizes when these two walls come together to go through and create the corner. That was the biggest issue before Creo 7. When you added a wall over here, it didn't recognize there were already 2 walls on the sides. And so then you had to go through and do a bunch of messing around to go through and get these corners to be created the way you want. Now in Creo 7 and higher, when you come over here and add a wall to this edge, it's going to recognize there's 2 walls on the side, and it's going to go through and make its own corner there by itself. So much simpler because of that. But those are your basic choices for the flat wall. Now the flange wall is also a very common type of wall. Here you're just going to go through and pick edges, again, to locate it, but the edges don't need to be straight. These could be curved. You can see the end of that one part is curved, but they do have to be adjacent to each other. So all these edges you select have to touch each other. I couldn't pick an edge on the front and then a separate edge on the back that weren't connected. And then it's got a lot of the same choices. You know, you're going to be able to come over here again and control on what side does the sheet metal thickness get added. Again, you can turn off the bend radius if you want and say don't add the radius, just like you could with the flat wall. You can also come over here and choose different shapes. So there's like an I, an arc, an S, an open, a flush, a duct, a C, and a Z hem that you can choose from. So these are built into the system. Now, again, you can also come over and do user define and sketch out your own shape if you wanted to as well, just like you could with the flat wall. And then the length of the wall. Now, if you don't want this wall to go the entire length of the edge, again, you can drag the drag handle, but there's also going to be a length tab that you can come down here and you can set the length that way if you wanted to as well. So notice you can go through and do it blind, or you give it a length, or you could say to selected and go up to something if you wanted. And then also you're going to have the same bend position choices. You know, when it builds the wall, it's going to keep it even with the edge. You know, do you want the wall to extend beyond the edge? Do you want to offset the wall? Those choices all apply to a flange wall. Now, the only thing that's different is if you offset the wall, if you're doing a flange wall, you can only offset in. You cannot offset out and have the sheet metal get bigger. But that would be the only difference. And then you still have the same corner treatment. Again, I've got these 2 walls that I'm building at the same time. You know, how do they come together in the corner? You're going to get all the same options that we just looked at here for the flange wall as well. So I won't go over all those again, but they're the same. And then miter cuts. You can also do miter cuts here. Now, in this example, they actually are going along all the edges that are highlighted in green, and they're building a wall. But again, that wall starts to collapse through itself in the corner. So this is where I would need to have a miter cut to be able to create this. Now, you don't have quite as many miter cut choices here, but again, you can say it's going to be a closed corner like you see here, or you could come over and say, give me a tangent corner like you see down below. And then offset as a secondary wall. Now, we talked about offset as a primary wall where you had to have a surface. Well, you can take an existing face and you can just offset it to go through and create another wall. Now, this would go through and create another unattached wall. Eventually, you would need to take this piece that I just created and combine it in with the rest of the sheet metal. You can't have two unconnected pieces in the sheet metal mode when you're done, but during the construction phase, you could. And then also the twist wall. Now, this is a fairly miscellaneous wall. This lets you extend a wall, but it also lets you twist it on here. So they're picking that green edge to attach to, and they're really just turning this 61 degrees. And you can see the length of it. It's going to be 8 units long when they're done. But it lets you kind of change the angle of that wall. Again, I'll demonstrate this in a second, but it's really simple. And then last one I want to talk about is extend. Now, extend is actually over here under editing, so it's not under the wall area, but over here under extend, you can just basically pick an edge and, hey, I want to make this wall longer, and you can either key in a value or just pick something. I want to go up to this face, and it would then go through and extend that up to the face. So for close off small gaps and stuff, can be really useful in the sheet metal part. Those are your basic wall choices. So let me give you a quick demonstration. Question, Brian?
No question.
Okay. So let me go through and get Creo up here. Can you see my screen, or do I need to share my Creo window?
We're seeing your PowerPoint presentation right now.
Okay, I gotta close that out.
Agreed.
Okay, now you can see my Creo screen, correct?
There it is.
Okay, perfect. So what I want to do here is I want to create a new part here real quick. So I'm just going to come over here and say new. And again, it's going to be part, but I do want to make sure I turn on sheet metal here real quick. And I don't really care about the name. I'll use the default template and say okay. And then I will come over here and turn my datums on just so you can see them here. Now I'm currently using Creo 8 as my demonstration platform. So you can see it's got the new shaded datums on there. So I want to come over here and I want to start just a really simple extrude for my base wall. Now, when I say extrude again, it's going to either want me to pick an existing sketch or create one. So I'm just going to come over here and sketch on the front. And when I get myself into the sketcher, remember, I just need to draw the side profile. So I'm just going to draw a line coming out, a line coming up, a line over. I'm going to draw a hat section here as the shape that I want on there. Now, the dimensions aren't super critical, but I am going to go through and just add a couple dimensions here. And let's go through and make this dimension like 5. I'm going to make this dimension here 4. Go through and make this one 5 again over there. So that's going to go through and be the shape. Now notice I didn't try and sketch the radiuses on here. I'm going to let the computer add those. So I'm just going to come over here and say okay. And then when I do that, it's now going to ask me for my thickness up above. So I'm going to make this a lot thicker so we can see it better. So let's make this like 0.15 thick. And then you can start to see the radiuses on there. Now with this again, over here under options, if I was to turn off add bends on sharp edges, it would go through and make the corners square. But as long as that choice is turned on, it's going to add the radiuses. Now it's going to default to the thickness of the sheet metal. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to override that. I'm just going to come over here and type in 0.5. I want my inside bend radius here to be 0.5 on all of those bends. And then for my depth, again, I just got to come over and get a depth set. I'm just going to come over here and switch this and make this go both sides here, symmetric. And then for my length, I'll just make it a little bit longer on here. Now that looks good, I'm just going to say, okay, I've got my primary or base wall created as an extrude. Now, I don't really need to see the datums anymore, so we'll go through and turn those off to get them out of the way. And I want to come back here and I want to do a planar wall. This was one of the choices you had as a base wall, but it can also be created as a secondary wall. And I'm just going to say I want to make a planar wall here. And it's going to ask me again to pick a sketch or make one. So I'm just going to sketch on that face right there. Zoom in on here. And I'm going to keep this pretty simple. So I'm just going to go through and make a rectangle. But I'm going to add kind of a flange sticking out on there. And then again, for my dimensions, I don't care. So I'll leave them as they are. What I wanted to show you is anytime that you reuse one of the primary walls as a secondary wall, there's going to go through and be an option here that will allow you to merge to model. So what's going to happen is this new piece is going to automatically become part of what I already had. Now, if I go back here to that wall, edit definition, I could come over here and say, okay, do not merge the model. And then what it's going to do is it's going to go through and keep that piece separate on here. Now, if I look down below here, it actually says 2. This means I have 2 distinct areas. So there's actually 2 pieces here. And there's kind of the original, and there's that piece right there to show me it's not one big piece of sheet metal right now. Now, you could manually merge these together with the merge wall command later if you wanted. But again, it's probably easier to let the computer do it. So I'm just going to go back here again and edit definition. And I'm going to turn that option back on. So merge into model. And that way it combines itself right away. I don't have to manually do it. And you can see now down below, it doesn't tell me I have 2 pieces anymore. It's one big piece of sheet metal. Okay, so let's come back here, get to my default view. And let's go through and talk about now the flat wall, because this is a really common type of secondary wall. And so I'm just going to spin around here, use kind of this back side to add a flat wall. Now, when I do that again, it's going to ask me for a placement edge. And I'm going to pick this edge. Now, if you pick the top edge, the wall will go down. If you pick the bottom edge, the wall will go up. So I'm going to have the wall go down so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. And then notice there's a bunch of handles here. Again, there's a handle here for adjusting the length. There's a handle here for adjusting the distance in from the end. On here, there's a handle here for going through and changing the angle of the wall on here. Now I'm going to set the angle back up here to 90 degrees on here. And then again, this distancing from the end, I'm also going to go through to make that 0. So it goes back to the full length. Now remember, you do have different shapes over here. You know, I've got trapezoid, L, T, and so on. So there's my trapezoid shape. You know, here's my L shape. On here, you could switch into these other ones on here. And again, notice there's dimensions that you could then go through and modify on there. Now, up above here, if I go back to just the rectangle wall, you know, this is the thickness we discussed. You know, the computer is keeping kind of this sheet metal even. If I flip my thickness, it's adding the sheet metal thickness to the outside of the edge on here. And then we kind of mentioned you could go through and kind of adjust this position. There is a bend position choice here. So it's currently even with the sheet metal. Now, if I come over here and say, okay, I want to add all the bend to the outside, notice how the bending starts to occur at the line I selected. If I come over here and do an offset, there's actually a dimension here that I can offset. I can make this wall longer, or I can go through and make that wall shorter from the original edge on here. And then again, these 2 choices, just where do you measure from? Everything's the same. It's just where's the measurement taken from is different. And then if your wall is not 90 degrees, you know, let's say I come over and say, okay, I want this wall to be maybe 60 degrees here. With that, this is where I'm going to shorten it up a little bit. Otherwise, it may be too long. If I was to use this choice right here, you know, it would go through and make this even with the end of that. So as this wall grows longer, you can see it moves back and forth with that choice turned on. So you just got to make sure you got the right bend position that you want. Now I'm going to switch this back to 90 degrees for this bend on there. And then relief. You know, I'm going to make this wall shorter here. So I need some type of relief here at the end now. So if I come over here under relief, I can't really do corner relief right now. I'll show you an example of that in a second, but I can do bend relief. And then notice it's going to do rip relief. And if I come over here and switch it, I could go through and do stretch. It's not going to go through and kind of make that little deformation area here. I could also come over and say, I want to do rectangle. Again, I want to come over here and do oblong. And again, you got areas, of course, fields for changing values. How big do you want? Now, this also doesn't go the entire length on the other end. Notice it adds relief over there too. If you want them to be different, just turn on define each side separately. And then it's a little bit tough to sell, but the right side is side number 1. Notice how it's kind of highlighting in red. This is side number 2. So I could turn on side number 2 and say, okay, I want that end. I just want to have rip. So they could be different potentially if you wanted on there. Those would be your different, you know, bend relief choices you would get for the wall. Here, and let's say cancel out of this wall. And what I want to do here now is I want to create a new wall that has more than one edge. So I'm going to come over here and say, okay, let's do a flat wall. And let's pick this edge here. And I'm just going to do control. And I'm going to go through and pick that edge there. And I won't make the wall quite so long, so I don't have to zoom out so far to see it. And so now you can see how it picked multiple edges. So now I can come over here and start to control this corner over here. So this is where I got to pay attention now to my corner treatment. Now I'm going to close some of these other dialog boxes here that I got open over here. And if I go to corner treatment over here, it's asking me. Now notice there's corner number 1. That's this corner right here. And there's corner number 2, which is actually this back corner here. This new wall detected there was a wall there. And so that's corner number 2. And what, if I look at this, you can see how it's kind of cutting this corner back on here. So it's creating without a seam. So I could come over here and say create with a seam. So it just kind of, leaves that rip on here. Or I could come over here and say do not create at all. And then it's really not trying to create anything special in that corner. Now, this will come into play here in a second when we go through and talk about our corner relief. So I'm going to leave it right now here at, let's say, create with seam. And then notice here in the corner here, you can come over and narrow the corner. That would just go through and kind of close off this corner here. If I go through and narrow that. Now, also, I got to be careful. I got to go back here to corner number 1. I want to narrow this corner. I had corner number 2 turned on. And that's why nothing happened there with that. So that's going to be my corner treatment. But again, notice I currently got it set to open. I could go through and do a gap where it's going to specify a gap. I could come over here and do blind. Again, where I got gaps in both directions, I could do an overlap on here if I wanted as well. So you'll find all those choices under corner treatment. I'm going to leave it open. Now, what I want to do now that I got my corner treatment set, is I want to come back over here under my relief. And I don't really have to do bend relief, but I do want to do corner relief. I want to add some relief where these two walls come together on here. So it's currently V-notch, and I'm going to come down here and turn on circle. And when I turn on circle now, it starts to add the circle. And again, I can control, where is this? It's currently at the corner point. I'm going to do the intersection of the bends. And then for the size, I'm going to have to make this bigger. I'm going to put it at 5. I'm guessing at this number. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now you notice it's making this one corner, but it's also doing the same thing back over here. It's adding a circle notch in that other corner, which I really don't want. This is where, okay, I got the right shape at the one end. I'm going to close this. My corner treatment is going to come into play. On corner number 2, I said create with seam. So the computer considers this to be a corner that it should add the notch on. If I come over here and drop down and say do not create, it's going to recognize that, hey, I shouldn't pay attention to that other wall, and I shouldn't try and add some type of notch on the other end. On there. So it is a little bit tricky sometimes when you start to do your corner reliefs. You've got to kind of pay attention to your corner treatment settings as well. But now that everything looks good, again, I'm just going to come over here and say okay to go through and create that wall. Now, let's do an example where I need to go through and do a miter cut. I've got kind of this area right here. I want to come back and I want to add some walls along here. So I'm going to come over and just do some flat walls again. And so I'm going to pick this edge right here. I'm going to do control, pick this edge here, and I'm going to pick this edge here. And this is where these walls start to overlap each other. Now, again, if I come back over here to my miter cut area, notice it's got add miter cuts turned on automatically. If I was to go through and turn that off, notice it would actually build the walls overlapping on here. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to turn the miter cut on. And again, I can choose the type. Is it going to go through and be an open corner? Is it going to go through and be closed? Is it going to go through again and be a rip corner on there? So I'm just going to leave it tangent. It's going to go up to the tangent and cut the rest of that away. And of course, down below here, you can adjust the gap distance and stuff if you want. I could come down here and put in some other value potentially. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm just going to come up here now and say okay to go through and create my miter cuts on there. Those are kind of the flat wall choices, but a lot of things to pay attention to again up here as far as your drop down, tabs for your settings on there. Okay, I'm going to cancel out. Now let's do the flange wall. I'm just going to kind of spin around here, pay attention to this front side. And you're going to get a lot of the same choices for flange walls on here. Now, actually, before I do a flange wall, I do want to give you one example here of going through and doing a flat wall where I don't use one of the predefined shapes. I come over here and I pick this edge, and I don't really want this to be rectangle. I want this to go through and be some other shape. This is where, again, I'm going to come over here to shape, and I'm going to say sketch. And it's just going to take me into the sketcher, and it shows me this is what the rectangle, the shape that currently the computer is using. You can actually delete all this stuff if you want on here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch in my own shape on here, whatever I want this to be on here. Now, if you look carefully, there are a couple like little X's here. That's the end of the edge that I selected to. And so when I go through and make my sketch now, I don't really have to go right to those points, but I can if I want to. But I could now go through and sketch any shape I want. But you must close this back to that edge. You don't need to close it, but the end of the sheet metal wall has to come up to that edge to be valid. And now that I've got that sketched out again, I can say, okay. And now notice it's going to go through and use my shape to build the wall. But pretty much all your other choices would go through and be the same on there. Okay, so I'm just going to say, okay, there's my different flat wall possibilities. Now let's go through and do a flange wall. Now with the flange wall, again, you can hit the button. Again, you got the different shapes over here, so very similar. And I'm just going to start with the eye wall. And if I just go through again and pick like this edge right here, and don't do control now, do shift. You can pick the next edge that you want to go through and add. And then it's going to add on to that. Again, I can't pick an unconnected edge. That won't work on there. And that's going to go through and start to create the wall. Now, again, the different shapes over here, I could go through and do like an arc wall on here. And if you come over to the shape tab and you do your section preview, you can kind of see what dimensions it's putting on here for that. You can also come over here and do like an S wall. You can come over here and do an open hem, where it just kind of wraps it around. You could also come over here and do a flush hem. This is super great for putting hems on your model on here. I probably have to flip my side around here to get this one to work on there with that. So you are getting a number of choices with this, but I'm just going to leave it at the eye wall because that one's super simple to see on here. And again, for the length, I'm going to shorten this up here a little bit. Now, if you do want to go through and adjust how far this goes, again, you do have the drag handles, like we talked about before, to drag the ends, but you can also come over here under length, and you could come over here and use kind of the drop down. See, I want to go up to something I select or something as well on here with that. So a little bit different, but very similar to what you have with the flat wall. And again, the bend position choices, these are all the same that we saw earlier. It's going to add the material to the outside. It's going to be even with that. You'll get the same choices. Same thing if I come over here for corner treatment, I'm going to get the same corner treatment choices here. I can narrow the corner and stuff just like before, choose the type that I want to have. So lots of similarities on here. Now, again, I really can't do miter cuts in this corner. We'll do a miter cut example here in a second. And then again, you're still going to get the same relief choices over here. So again, I can do both bend and corner relief. Okay, in this one corner here, I'll move this out of the way. I want to come down here and do, again, the circle corner on here. So I'll go through and set this the same as before. Create that. Okay, once that looks good, let's go through and say, okay. So that would be an example of a flange wall. Now, to get the miter, what if I go through and do a flange wall along edges? Here, these edges on the inside of this loop again. So when I do the flange wall again, I'm going to pick the first edge that I want to start with. And then again, if you do your shift key, you can pick other edges that you want to go through and follow on here. And so you can see it's now going through and adding along. So keep in mind, there's more than one way to kind of add some of these walls sometimes on here. I could use the flat wall. I could use the flange wall pretty much equally, easily here. Now, again, with the miter cut, though, again, you get the same, not quite the same miter cut choices. Now, you have to have a miter cut here. If you turn this off, this wall overlaps. That will not work on here. But again, you're going to get the tangent. You're going to get the closed corner. Those choices are the same as before. So I'm going to go back here to tangent to kind of repeat what I did on the other side. Now, once that looks good again, I can now just come over here and say, okay, and that will build the flange wall. And then one other thing I want to show you here, I'm going to go delete that wall I made here. And again, I kind of talked about with the flat wall now, there's automatic corner detection. This is where, again, what's the computer going to go through and do at the end of this over here? When I go back over here to my, so many dialog boxes open, I'm going to close some of those here. When I go back to my corner treatment, I can go through and kind of control, what's going to go through and happen at the end. Do I create that end with the seam? Do I not create it? This is what you could not easily do pre-Creo 7 on here. Whereas with Creo 7, I can kind of tell the computer what to do at each end here and make this new wall kind of blend in very easily with the existing walls on there. And that's a huge improvement from what they had before on there. Now, once that looks good again, I could come over here and say, okay, and that would go through and add the wall at the end. So those are your two primary secondary walls, flat and flange. And I just want to show you one or two more things here before we're done. And one of them is I want to come back here and show you the offset wall. Now with this offset wall, come down below here, and it really just asks you to pick a surface. So if I pick the side of the part, I can just go through and offset this out to go through and create a new wall. So basically pick a face, specify the distance away. Now again, that is creating a second distinct piece. Eventually I would need to combine that piece into the rest of the sheet metal when I was done, but you could offset it and then build pieces in between at that point. So that would be how offset works as a secondary wall. And then also there was twist and extend. I'm going to spin around here, go back to this little flange that I created here that sticks out. And I'm going to come back over here and do a twisted wall. And when I come over here and say twist, it's going to ask me to pick an edge. And again, it does have to be straight, but I'm going to pick that edge right there. And that really is just asking me for a length. So how far do you want this thing to stick out? Let's say 3 units here. And then what do you want the angle to be? So I'm going to come over and say, okay, let's twist that 90 degrees. And it's going to twist it around on here. Now, there are some other settings here. With offset turned on, this new wall is going to be the same width as the existing piece. If I was to turn on like symmetric here, there's actually some handles and you can adjust this value, but you can see it does stay symmetric about the center of that. If I turn that on, I also could come over here and modify the width. Now the modify the width is at the other end. What if I want this other end to be some other value? I could go through and modify that if I wanted to. So that's really what the twist wall does. It just really kind of adds on and twists it to whatever angle you specify. And then the extend. What if I need to go through and make a wall a little bit longer or something? Hey, okay, I got left this gap here and I want to extend this out on here. I could go back, of course, and edit definition and change some settings, probably solve that problem. But a little bit faster maybe is just to come over here and extend it. Now, when I extend a wall, I can just pick on an edge. You'll want to pick this edge right here, and I could just extend that out very quickly. All I got to do is specify a value, or I could go up to something that I selected on here. If I want to do those, I want to extend this edge right here. And so again, it's going to now ask me for a value. Now, what you want to pay attention to, though, is you want to come over here under your extension dropdown. Notice it's currently set to normal, and that's what those two little perpendicular symbols represent. I'm coming straight out from there. So for side number 1, which is the top side, if I was to do a long boundary edge, what it would do if I shorten this up is you'll notice it'll actually continue the contour of that existing wall around. Now, when I get too far, it fails on here. But if I come over here and just turn on normal, it's just going to come straight out instead on there. So there are some settings that kind of control how it handles the sides of what you're building. And then rather than keying a length, I could just come over and say like up to plane. I want to go up to that plane right there. And that would be a fast way to go through and kind of bring that wall out to close off that corner. Now, since I had a gap in both directions, I would probably have to do the same thing here on the other side as well. Let me turn this around here. I hold the right key down on my mouse and come over and do one more extend. So I'm going to extend this edge out And again, I'm just going to extend up to plane, and I'm just going to pick the inside face of this thing. As my reference. So it's kind of nice for closing out gaps. So it looks like I got the front face. Well, I'll just live with the overlap for right now on there. But those were the different kind of sheet metal wall options I wanted to go through and show everybody.